Lighting can really make or break a scene, and in this tutorial we're going to have a look at how to adjust and control lighting. If you want to follow along, we're in Lights AEP, which you can find in the Introduction to 3D folder. Now before we look at lights, I'm just going to double click the camera dialog box, just so that you can see that when I make adjustments to the camera, using the dialog box, I can see those changes update in the main composition window. And this is a fairly new feature to CS 5.5, the ability to actually preview changes in dialog boxes. And it's really, really handy when it comes to using cameras and lights. Now at the moment I don't have any lighting in this scene, and you can tell because it's very, very flat. But if we switch on this button here, which is my shy switch, you'll see that I have some lights in here. And what we're going to do is have a look at some of these lights. The first light that I have here is environmental parallel light, which is kind of casting an all-over light. And this is a directional light, so I can actually control the direction. But if I'm not too worried about controlling the direction, I could change this to a different light type. And quite often for an environment light, I use an ambient light. So I'm going to call it Environment Ambience. And I'm going to change the light type to ambient. And you'll notice that as I do, it brightens up a lot because basically the intensity is at 100%. So I'm going to bring the intensity back down to 20 because we just want this to give a small amount of light. If I need to adjust it, I can also adjust it here in the main window just by adjusting the intensity. So we have our overall ambience. We then need to light the subjects. So we have our girls' point light, which is lighting up these girls. And of course I can adjust the intensity if I need that a little bit stronger. So it's just giving the girls an overall lighting. I can also adjust the fall-off distance, and this was new to 5.5. Previous versions of After Effects, I had no control over where the light fell off. And you'll notice that it's being cast and falling off very, very gradually. I can now control that, and there are two ways of controlling it. I can use inverse square clamped law, which is a real-world physics law which controls how the light falls off. So it's basically a mathematical equation that will work out the laws based on real-world physics. Now sometimes you want things to behave like the real world, other times you don't. You want to kind of creatively tweak what would happen in the real world and make it surreal. In those situations, you can choose smooth. And with smooth, you also get a radius, but you also get a fall-off distance. So it's kind of like feathering the edges, if you like. Okay, so you can decide how hard a fall-off distance you have, so whether it falls off quickly or over a longer distance. And then you have cast shadows options. Now at the moment, we're not really casting any shadows, so really, I don't need that switched on, so I'm going to click on OK and switch that off for now. That's just to give our girls an overall lighting. Now again, I can open up the light options, adjust the intensity if I need to. Okay, so I don't need to go into the dialog box. Then I've added some spotlights. Okay, so there's 2 or 3 spotlights there lighting the scene. And these are called disco spots. And if I select them, you'll see they have cone angles, and I've animated them. I've animated the point of interest and the colour. And if we just preview a little bit of that by using spacebar, we can actually see those cones moving around. So all I've done there is actually dragged the point of interest and moved it around to create these swishing lights. And it's just like a real camera. So the camera has a kind of pyramid. The lights have a cone, and the cone determines what is affected by the spotlight. So that's creating kind of disco lighting for us. If we want to see that without the cones, we can just hit a RAM preview and see how that reacts with our scene. Now we're starting to get a few shadows there. You'll notice that shadows are being cast. And if I double click one of these, so let's just pick one at random, you'll notice the cast shadows option is indeed on. And if I switch that on and off, you can notice the shadows appearing and disappearing. Now I can make them a bit lighter. So lighten the shadows up a bit, maybe make them a bit softer. Now we're in draft 3D mode or fast draft mode. So we're not really going to see the soft edges, but if you were in adaptive resolution or final quality, you'd be able to see those nice soft edges. Now we could also put fall off on there as well. If we want to extend or reduce the cone angle, that's one way of doing it, just making the light fall off a little bit further. And of course we can do the distance as well. So I'll click on OK after looking at that. And then this one here, we've created a flicker light. So this light, if I double click it, is a point light. And a point light is an omnidirectional light, like a light bulb. And again, we can adjust the fall off of the light bulb. We can get it to cast shadows as well. And what I've done here, if we double hit the U key, is I've actually added an expression which will randomize the intensity and animate the color. So if we preview that, you'll see that's added an overall flicker to the scene. So it's starting to look really like a kind of nightclub scene. Okay, let's just preview a little bit of that. Okay, so you can see how lights really bring a scene together. And then the final light that we're going to talk about here is this one here. This is the shadow caster. Now you can add a light specifically for casting shadows. So we could put the shadow darkness at 100 and just maybe change the radius and fall off distance as well. In fact, let's just turn that off for a second so that we can see the full extent of our light. Now you might say to me, well, it's called shadow caster, but I can't see any shadows. That's because it depends on the position of the light as well. If we look at top view here and select our shadow caster, the shadow caster is behind the layers. So we may need to move it in order to get the shadows we want. If I move it in front of the cogs, notice the edges of the cogs are lighting up. If I now drag it behind, we can start to see shadows in the edges of the cog. We can also determine which layers cast shadows as well, and which layers accept shadows, which we'll have a look at when we cover material options. So that's a little bit about lighting. You can have a look at the end composition if you want, which has a little bit more finished lighting in it. The other thing to note is if you are working on lighting and you really want to see the softness of shadows and the fall-off distance, it's going to be a bit slow if you don't have a supported card working in adaptive resolution or final quality. So you can try adaptive resolution. This machine here does not have a supported graphics card, so it'll probably take quite a while to render just one frame. And this is something that you need to be aware of when you're working with 3D. You need to check the Adobe website. They have a list of supported graphics cards. If your card's not on the list, then chances are you're going to have quite a slow, painful preview process at anything other than fast draft mode. It's fine for working in fast draft mode, but if you want to see your lights without having to go through this painful process of waiting that long for a frame to render, then you can always switch off ray traced render. Now you will lose the extrusion and the curves, but you can always just get an idea of what the lighting looks like by switching to classic 3D temporarily. And you'll see that we can still have a look at our lighting and adjust the shadows and get a rough idea of where our 3D elements will be. And at any time you can switch back to Ray Trace 3D. And all of the changes that we made before, let me just switch that to... Now if I'm trying to switch to fast draft mode and I can't actually access the menu, I can quickly hold down caps lock key and that will stop the preview from happening until I release caps lock key. Okay, so as you can see, I haven't lost any of the extrusion or the curves just from switching between classic 3D and ray traced. So that's a little bit about lighting and a few workarounds when you're working with ray traced 3D.